Good evening. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. It's really wonderful um, to have such a big group here, and I know that uh, you're here really for Gauri. Uh, it's I've been looking forward for so long to have an event in Bangalore, and it's intimidating though at the same time because so many of you knew Gauri well. I never had the privilege of meeting her, and so it's difficult to know what I could tell you that you don't already know. But well, something the three of us were talking about beforehand is that one of the things that fascinated me most about Gauri was that she was someone who really had such a complex life with many phases, many changes, and that even people who knew her well often knew maybe one side of her or several sides of her, but didn't always know the whole picture. And that's why it was such a privilege in writing this book to be able to speak to so many people who could speak to so many different sides of her at different moments in her life. And it's why I'm so grateful to have Shivsundar and Pushpamala here tonight, who both knew her in really distinct ways. Um, and many people who I spoke to when I was reporting this book, many of the people who knew her best, told me that after her death, uh, even they, were surprised at the outpouring in the streets that happened after she was killed. Of course, it was an enormous shock, and that was part of it. But uh, even many of her closest loved ones were surprised, they told me, at just the sheer variety of people who came out in response to her murder and didn't actually know that she had connected with so many people. Um, and that too was one of the things that interested me the most. And, you know, I'll tell you a little bit about how I got involved in writing this book. I'd been reporting in South India for some years at that point, and I'd been spending a lot of time in Bangalore in particular. Not always because I had anything to do here, but just because I like Bangalore. And so I would just find excuses to come here, and my family and I would stay here for a month or two at a time while I was working on other things. And we were thinking of moving here at one point also. And I had just been here for the month of August 2017, had just gone home to New York City when the news came about Gauri's death. I'd heard of Gauri, hadn't met her, um, but it immediately became international news that Gauri had been murdered, and I was just about to suggest to my editor at the New York Times Magazine that I write about it when she actually suggested it to me. And so it was interesting, it became such a big international news story that something quickly got lost, I think, about exactly who she is. Because immediately assumptions were made about why she was a significant person. Um, and she's someone who, as you all know, is very well known in Bangalore. I realized over the course of reporting this book that everyone I knew in Bangalore had knew her and had met her and all had their own personal connections and moments with her. Um, but outside of Bangalore, elsewhere in India and then internationally, there was a way of talking about her as if like, assuming that she'd been targeted because she was one of India's most prominent journalists. She wasn't one of India's most prominent journalists. She was actually quite a specifically local figure. And I think that's actually a lot to do with why she was important and also why she was dangerous. It's actually the local journalists who are writing not in English, but in all the many regional languages of India, who pose the biggest threat, who have the most direct connection with their readers, even when their audiences are small. They're the ones who are most often murdered. Um, and um, and I came to see it as, is this understandable but kind of a lazy assumption that Gauri's significance lay strictly in her profession. Because we tend to do that to people. We tend to reduce them to their job titles and think that that's what makes them special. I think there's a great deal about Gauri's journalism that was special and unique. And I get into that in a lot of detail in the book. But the way I came to see it is, what really touched me about Gauri and which really came to actually change my own life is the way that she lived her life and the lessons I think that she had to give about how to live a life. And in my mind, after spending years immersed in her life, what to me seemed most significant to me about her was, and unique about her, was her talent for friendship, her talent for connecting with people, her talent for creating community, her absolute refusal to hold a grudge, even as she was always willing to have a bitter argument. um, and her increasing over the course of her career, her increasing refusal to pretend to be neutral. And all those things had a huge influence, actually, on the course of my own life. And that, this is a book where, I'm following an investigation. There's a mystery to be solved of who killed her and why, and that's in there. But to me, what really sustained me over the years of working on this book was the mystery of really how to live a life and the lessons that she gives us about how to live a life. And it made me examine myself, seeing her example of how she was able to cultivate and maintain so many different friendships with so many different kinds of people. It really made me reflect on my own approach to friendship and how I'd actually been neglecting my friendships. And what a rich and important part of my life I was abandoning. And it actually changed the way that I approach friendship. It also changed the way that I think about journalism. I was trained in a system where neutrality is one of the highest values, or at least the pretense of neutrality. I write most often for the New York Times Magazine, which the New York Times studiously presents itself as a neutral publication. But as anyone who reads it knows, it's anything but neutral. And pretending to be neutral is actually much more dangerous than the alternative. And Gauri really came to understand that. It was a journey that she took over the course of her life, where she was a much more, in the 90s when she was a magazine reporter for big English language magazines, she was a much more conventional journalist in the same way that I've been a conventional journalist. Writing with this pretense of neutrality. And once she took over her father's paper and started writing in Canada and became much more connected to the ground realities of the state that she lived in, she abandoned this pretense of neutrality. Had a huge influence on how I think. And I now make a point not to pretend to be neutral. I have opinions, we all do. I have a perspective. It's the whole reason I write. Is not to present some sort of supposed objective set of facts, but to actually convey an idea. And I'm no longer willing to pretend otherwise, that I don't have a position, that I don't have a politics, and that I don't have something specific to say. And it's really thanks to Gauri's example that I've arrived at this place. I'd really love for Shivsundar and Pushpamala to talk about their own experience in knowing Gauri and really, how you saw her change over time, and what kind of effect she had on you in knowing her. Maybe Pushpamala, you could start.
Yeah, like to start by complimenting you or congratulating you on the book, Rollo.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
I've just read it. Apparently, it was released last year, but I didn't know about it. You didn't inform us. So I
Sorry.
just read it just before. I mean, I finished reading it yesterday, and it's brilliant. It's a brilliant book. And I'd also like to congratulate the publishers for publishing it in the first place and BIC for holding this event. So
Absolutely.
it's quite unusual. You know what the situation is like. So, I mean, everybody, there are a lot of quotations over here, and everyone says it's a thriller written in the form of a thriller. And of course it is, but actually it's not written like a taut thriller. It has sort of meanders around. I mean, it builds up the case quite slowly, and it's got some absolutely hilarious bits actually. And right at the end, like the last two, three chapters, then it becomes really taut when he's actually talking about the murder plan and all. It's very chilling actually. So I loved. I'll tell you about some of the parts I loved. One was this, the Pune police commissioner is supposedly investigating Dabolkar and Pansare's death. So he calls their spirits. So there's this whole paragraph. He or he gets somebody else to call the spirits. Sorry, I
He
marked
hires
it out.
a former policeman who'd reinvented himself as a spirit medium.
Yes. So they call Dabolkar spirit. And so it's so deliciously ironical because Dabolkar was fighting for, and Pansare were fighting for rationalism. And, and this guy, I mean, it's very funny, but I don't think it's as innocent as all that he's dumb. You forgot to mention actually in the chapter that the BJP was ruling Maharashtra. So the BJP government was there in Maharashtra at the time. So I think it's a kind of rigmarole and a kind of runaround. And there's this other chapter on the Sanatan Sanstha, and when he introduces it, I think I've marked it. It's because it's. I was fascinated by the aesthetic of Sanatan Sanstha's website, a soothing palette of soft pastel colors, every surface clean and smooth and bright, every face smiling beatifically, symmetrical and unblemished. Highlighted on the home page were the results of an experiment the group had conducted a month earlier, on December 7, 2017. Using an instrument called the Universal Thermoscanner, which looks like a pair of bright yellow ray guns with pink nozzles at the ends, a white gloved technician had taken a reading of Atavale's empty lunchbox in order to measure its aura. In a prose style that married the empirical and the metaphysical to a degree rarely found outside the literature of Scientology, the report concluded that the lunchbox's aura extended exactly 8.6 times wider than what then would be expected from an ordinary object. So that's the beginning of the chapter on the introduction to the Sanatan Sanstha. So, but of course, and then there's another bit that I really loved. It's complete crazy, like and kind of like seems like an aside, and that's when you take off on Saint Thomas. So he starts off by saying that this, Saint Thomas was assassinated, and this whole myth of him coming to India and so on. So he starts investigating this thing and goes round and round and round in Kerala, and then. Tamil Nadu and all that, and then then there comes this autobiography of him being married to a Malayali Christian and so on. And he says it's sort of, he's talking about it because it's related to Gauri's assassination, but actually it's nothing to do with Gauri's assassination. But what is very interesting is that it brings in this whole civilizational, thing. And so he situates Gauri in so many things that are happening. I mean, it goes back and forth in time, and especially in this St. Thomas part, because it goes to BC or something like that, and then down to the present and all the quarrels that are going on between the Syrian Christians and whatever, the whole situation today, and the Muslims and the Hindus and the political parties and so on. So it's got a, on the one hand, yes, it is very entertaining to read. It's really, I mean, I'm sorry, Gauri would have loved it actually, and she would have cackled, like hell about this, what I, quoted. She would have loved it. But it's not really like a thriller because it's much more ambitious than a thriller. So when we read a political thriller, it's got that taut kind of prose, And I think at the end and some parts there is that kind of prose. But what happens is that he's he's going round and round actually in a way, and that really, as I said, brings in this kind of civilizational kind of breadth about what really India is today.
Well, thank you so much, Pushpamala. I really appreciate that. Um, it is a very digressive book, and I was determined to be digressive. Yeah, thank you. Shivsundar, maybe you could speak a little bit about your history with Gauri, and yeah.
First, I will talk my history with you.
Yes.
In fact, I met Rollo,
Either way, I answered anything.
because just now he was telling that it is Rollo, not Rollo.
Yeah,
But in
yeah.
Kannada, I used to, it is Rollo, it is Rollo.
Yeah, that seems fine.
Uh, in fact, I have been visiting. First of all, congratulations. It's a very fantastic book. And out of the 23 chapters, except for the 2 chapters, which is a digression about Masal Dosa and St. Thomas, other 21 chapters actually describes the 21 dimensions of Gauri Lankesh, if you can say so. Not 21, because some 8 chapters are about the trial and other things. But most of us have impressions about Gauri. I think many of the friends who are sitting in the hall, some are human rights activists who actually traveled along with Gauri. Some are actually revolutionary activists who Gauri helped to come open and be in the democratic mainstream. And some are friends who met her in the last 3 hours, who met her. I think many of you are characters in this book. I think many of you could speak well about Gauri. But the thing is, this give a this book gives a comprehensive understanding of Gauri in whatever way it is possible. Comprehension is a very relative term. You have looked at Gauri in what possible ways to look at her. So even to me, I had a intimate association with Gauri for more than say some 14 years. I first met her in 2002 when she had already taken over Lankesh, editorship of the Lankesh Patrike, which we realized she was only an employee when she was ousted because of covering the being sympathetic to the left wing extremism in 2006. But then the Gauri we saw was a different Gauri. And by 2017, September 5th, when she was actually assassinated, the Gauri who was in 2017 was completely different. To me, Gauri is a possibility of the transformation. To me, Gauri is a hope. To me, as an activist, because I have been in activism for more than 40 years, most of us activists actually are overtly, we actually work in the external sphere. We work for some values. But the larger question is how much values we assimilate into our personality. So that questions remain with activists of all kinds. But here Gauri stands out as a master. I should not say master. Take the female gender of the master in that sense. See, she actually assimilated the values. So I have seen from the close quarters how she evolved into a better human being an activist. We'll be activists fighting the enemies outside, but are we fighting the enemies within ourselves? So that she actually fought, and to give a anecdote or a kind of metaphor, she had a washroom in the office, and she was not allowing any others to use that washroom. A typical kind of urban thing. But by 2017, when we participated, in fact, there is another activist friend by name. Her name is also Gauri. She always cites this example. When she went for a agitation of Adivasis, in fact, there was a agitation against the eviction of the Adivasis. They were made to stay in a hotel room, and there were many Adivasis and women. So they came and used the washroom. And Gauri, that activist Gauri friend, cites an example where this Gauri was cleaning the washroom after they went out. That was the transformation, and that was the empathy and sympathy she actually developed. She was sympathetic, but her journey can be defined as a journey from sympathy to empathy. She became one of them. That transformation is really a hope, because your book, I think, in the paperback, had another subtitle which said Murder of Gauri when
Oh, in
the
the US,
rise of
the US
autocracy
edition,
in India.
the rise of autocracy
The
in
rise of
India.
that is missing in this book. I don't know why.
Yeah.
You may answer that later. Now it is mystery. That is what myth making.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is rise of autocracy. This another important contribution of this book is that it locates a phenomena called Gauri in an age where autocracy is in the rise. How could she actually battle? How could she take in? How could she fight it? How could she make friends on this line? So that is very important. I think that transformation in the age of rise of autocracy. You say it autocracy, I call it a pure fascism,
Yeah.
which we are saying today. So a possibility, a hope. So that's what I understand Gauri as.
Yeah. No, I agree. I call it fascism too. And I call it fascism in the US as well. It's been, this book came out before Trump came back in the US. And it's been alarming and unsettling to see that a lot of the patterns that I described in the latter part of the book about the increasing grip of autocracy and the influence of fascism here has been played out in just such a similar playbook in the U.S. If anything, faster. If anything, he's going even faster. But that it is a playbook. It is a pattern, and these leaders are learning from each other. It's different different country, different subtitle. I Yeah, oh, please do.
Hey, I should actually share this anecdote with you because that was a cultural shock to Rollo also. We also met once again in the court hall when the trial was on. And in the court hall, Rollo was sitting in a typical American way like this. And the assistant who was a clerk there asked him to get out of the court hall because he was sitting in this way. That was a cultural shock. And I should also uh, tell the actual trial happened on that day. We can understand the courts of today. In fact, on that day, I think that was in the court hall number 1, principal judge of the Bangalore Magistrate Court was actually conducting the trial. The trial was of a construction worker. So construction worker narrated that he came back to his house at 7:30, 8 o'clock, and while he was having his food, he heard sounds of a pistol. And when he came out, he saw someone going away. What was the Patisawal? That is cross-examination. The cross-examination was done by Vishwa Hindu Parishad advocate. He was asking that, when did you come back to your house? He said that I came back at 8 o'clock. What were you doing? I was having food. You had food without taking bath? How can you do that? That was one question he asked. How could you do that? And he could not even, that was given as a kind of evidence that he is saying false. He's lying. And I should also narrate you another, how Kavita Lankesh was tried in the.
And let me just interject to say also, when he made that joke, that the judge unfortunately laughed.
Yeah, judge laughed.
Yeah.
Actually. That you had food without taking bath was a kind of laugh, which I wrote later.
Yeah.
And Kavita Lankesh was in the witness box, and what is that? Patisala. Cross-examination of Kavita Lankesh was on the lines of, who is the father of your daughter? We are in Karnataka, there is an episode where one film actress has come out to have her child without getting married, and that has become a very scandalous issue today. Even in the court hall, one of the cross-examination was about, so you did get married? So that was very scandalous. That was even taken to the level of actually examining the veracity of the statement made by Kavita Lankesh. So this is the kind of court house even we have today. And those were all kind of shocks to Rollo.
Yeah. Could you actually, Shivsundar, you've been paying probably closer attention than anyone aside from Kavita about how the trial is progressing. Could you give us an update on where the trial is now? It started 3 years ago.
Yeah.
Actually, the conspirators who they arrested, 17 men, were mostly arrested 7 years ago.
Yeah.
and the trial is still ongoing. Now they're all out on bail,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Yeah.
See, the assassination happened on 2017 September 5th. The major breakthrough investigation happened in 2018 February. Between 2018 February and 2018 August, most of the accused were arrested. Some 17 were arrested and one was arrested later and one is absconding even today. There were altogether 18 accused in the jail. And in 2018 November, a 10,000 page charge sheet has been filed already. Charge sheet has been filed in 2018 November. And the next stage is, Advocate Venkatesh is here, next stage is charging the accused, and the next stage should be trial. But the actual trial started in 2022 July. So there was a big delay of more than 4 years. That was used by the accused to obtain bail. How can you actually detain an accused without having trial was one of the major argument made by the accused. But such relief will be given to only right-wing people. You can see all the left-wing people without trial are languishing jails even today.
Yeah, Umar
Then,
Khalid.
yeah,
Bhima
Umar Khalid
Koregaon.
to Bhima Koregaon detainees, many Adivasis and many 2020 rate accused people, they are bright students, etc. The prosecution has actually listed more than 430 witnesses and around 1,000 evidence. Out of 430, in fact, the prosecutor, Balan, who is a very eminent and also a very sympathetic lawyer to the cause of the people, has been conducting the trial. And now there are 80 more witnesses have to be, still undergo trial. And Balan is ready to forego one few more witnesses so that the trial can go faster. But in the meanwhile, between 2018 and 2024, the accused actually appealed to the High Court and the Supreme Court repeatedly asking for the relief because the trial will go on endlessly. So, and it is actually not natural justice to retain any accused without being undergoing trial for a long time because it applies to both left wing and the right wing. And even I think Gauri would have not liked the accused to retain in the prison, So that was taken as alibi, and now all the 17 are out on bail, and the trial is going on. And the major demand by the Friends of Gauri Memorial Trust, and the larger public is to constitute a special court to actually conduct the trial on a regular basis. It so happens that the in charge judge, he is also in charge of the administrative duties. Hardly he can give time for the regular trial. This is a special trial, and hardly this trial takes at least at the maximum 4 to 5 days in a month. So Balan was telling me today that this month hardly one witness could be taken for trial, and there is also this counter questioning that happens later. So this goes on. So meanwhile, there are already reports that these accused are already threatening the witnesses. So we have been demanding to constitute a special court. So it is unjust to say that the accused are in the prison without trial, but you conduct the trial and punish them.
Yeah. And
That's
some witnesses have turned hostile, yeah?
Few out
Yeah.
of say up to now some 300 witnesses
Yeah.
have been tried, out of which some 10 are turned hostile.
Okay.
The rest of them are giving.
And months ago, the chief minister, Siddharamaiah, said that the trial would be fast-tracked. Never happened. Why do you think that is? I mean, he was actually a personal friend of Gauri's.
I was told that we are informed that even Gauri Lankesh made a petition. That petition has been forwarded to the High Court. The High Court has to take action. But the High Court, I am informed that a letter is written back to the government saying that there cannot be a privilege given to a particular case of a special trial court because so many cases are already languishing in the court. There cannot be a special treatment to a accused because of her social status.
Yeah.
That is the reply given by the High Court.
Yeah.
So now that option is also not much there, but we
Yeah.
have to pursue.
Yeah. Pushpamala, I'd love to hear, I know you have a lot of anecdotes of your experience with Gauri that I'd love to hear from you to it illustrates some of these other sides of Gauri.
Yeah, I think I'll talk a bit about how I knew when we met and how we knew each other. Actually, I knew Gauri's father, Lankesh, from the 1970s. When I was a kid, like just out of college, I was in the first year of PUC or second year PUC, I think. I acted in a play that he directed. I used to go and hang around in Central College, and I was part of this very rowdy gang of people, who used to just. But at that time, the English department was very famous. So T.G. Vaidyanathan was there. In fact, this group was around TGV, as he was called, and then there was Lankesh, who were the two famous people, but also the Vimla Rao was there and so on. I think Lankesh was also around that time made his first film Pallavi. So I heard the story that they couldn't afford to, there's some scene in which people had to be served food, and so Vimla Rao did the costumes and also organized the food where they mixed mud and water, I think, and served it as sar. So anyway, all this was going on, but he directed a play called Lysistrata, not like based on Lysistrata by Aristophanes, and it was called Sri Bandaya. So I was one of the extras actually. I didn't have a main role, but a whole lot of us young kids were there, and then it was full of foul language in Kannada which we didn't know, we didn't understand. So after that, some relative complained to my father, so I was banned from acting. So I knew, and Lankesh also used to come. We had a friend in Baswangudi. They lived in Baswangudi. I also grew up there. I'm also from Baswangudi, the same area, but we didn't know each other. But I knew Lankesh because he also used to come and play badminton in this ex-cricketer called K. Srinivasan. He had this kind of place which is a kind of adda where all the writers used to hang out. So a lot of writers used to come there every evening and have a drink and all that. And Lankesh used to come. In fact, he used to come with Chidanand Rajgata, who was a skinny young guy at that time. I think he was still a student, and they used to come and play badminton. He used to play it in his dhoti. But I got to know when about 20 years later in the 1990s, I built my studio in Rajarajeshwari Nagar, which was this kind of at the edge of Bangalore. It was out of the BBMP limits actually, and there's nothing there. Like there's just a few buildings, and so this K. Srinivasan, our friend, who was called Balaji, he said, "Oh, you're going to Rajarajeshwari Nagar, you get to contact Gauri and Kavita. And I'd never, the Lankesh's daughter's, Lankesh's daughter's house is there. So actually, when I moved in 1996, Gauri was in Paris for a year. So I never met her, but Kavita was staying in her house, for that 1 year. I think she was building her place in Padmanabhapuram, and she was living in Gauri's place at the time. So when Gauri, and by the way, Kavita is much more sort of restrained and than Gauri. Gauri is much more sociable and friendly. So when Gauri came, we immediately became friends. So we started hanging out together a lot, and we were practically neighbors. She lived 2 roads away from my place. And there are all these funny things like, we used to have a lot of parties because nobody used to visit us otherwise. So we had to throw a party. And so she had very different friends from mine. And so we got to know each other's friends and so on. So there was, in fact, I think you've quoted this in your book. And I've also written about it. I've written a piece on Gauri, which was published actually. And how in one party I had an accident and had broken my leg. So I had this kind of full leg plaster. So, but I wanted to go so I went for the party on crutches, and so I was standing on one leg and dancing. So there are all these funny things. I met a lot of the writers, she knew all the writers, and their children were her friends, like Anantamuti's children, and whatever, Vivek Shanbag, and so on. I think Chandan I met much later, who's also an RR Nagar kind of denizen. So they're very funny. Like she was, even up. So when at that time in the 1990s, like she was not at all political, And I think after that she went off to Delhi and she was working for TV, for Enadu TV. It had just begun, so she was having a great time in Delhi and all that. But she had to come back when she came back when Lankesh died. He suddenly died. Nobody expected it, and Lankesh Patrike was broke. I think it was in debt or something because Lankesh was very principled and he never used any ads, which Gauri followed that later on. When she took over the paper, so they only survived on subscriptions, sales actually, and it was so popular. I remember, like I used to get it, and Lankesh has also written about me in one of Lankesh Patrikas.
Oh, is that right? Yeah.
Yes, in his editorial. because I went to him asking for some donation. I was organizing a public art project, and I said, went to his place and I said, give me 5,000 rupees. So he tried to give me a lecture and said, no, no, nonsense. Like you shouldn't build anything. I don't believe in sculpture. I don't believe in all this public art. And then he quoted the Sharanas and he said, like, you shouldn't build anything permanent. I said, no, these are installations. They will be pulled down. They only last for like, for about 10 days or something like that. So anyway, he was very generous actually. He gave me 5,000 bucks. So, and he wrote about
because
it.
you knew it would be torn down.
No, he tried to wriggle out of it. So I know I was very friendly with him actually. I'd known him for a long time, and he was very accessible. Actually, I just walked into his Lankesh Patrika office and I said, "Give me 5,000 rupees." So, and he did. So he wrote about it in one of his editorials. So I loved Lankesh Patrike because he didn't have a in-house style. So and I had not studied Kannada much, but I'd learnt it on my own. So I really enjoyed all these little these different columns that he had, which had every kind of Kannada, from classical Kannada to slang, literary Kannada, then Dharwad Kannada, then he had this Chandre Gowda used to hilarious in rural Kannada used to write these kind of columns and so on, so this. But what happened, and then it was so popular that it was I'm talking about the language because it was people were delighted by this phenomenon. And I remember my friend Madhav Prasad, who's a film theorist. He was in Calcutta. He used to get the Lankesh Patrike over there, and we were once talking about it. He said like he just changed Kannada. He said suddenly there's this issue, and then the title of that issue is Bam Gum Yuddha. So that was Bangarappa and Gundura. So it was very slangy, and this kind of very just playing with words and all that. So anyway, when Gauri came down, I think everybody persuaded her not to take up the paper. But there are all these. It was heavily in debt, and they could not afford to pay uh, the salaries of the staff over there, even for that month. But I think she wanted to do it because she adored her father. In fact, apparently Chidanand Rajgata's famous line is, there are always three people in the bed with us, So she was adored, both Kavita and she adored their father, They thought he was the most handsome guy. And of course, he was incorrigible, but he was also very supportive. And he was, of course, a major figure and a major, not only writer, but filmmaker as well as, a journalist and editor and very influential figure. So when she came on, I think, as you said, first of all, she didn't know, she had never written in Kannada. She was an English journalist. And I don't believe when, you've quoted Chidanand as saying that she was deracinated and all that. I mean, I think that's all rubbish. Just because you don't write in Kannada doesn't mean you're deracinated. But also in the 90s, I don't believe she was not an atheist, because in her house, next to the kitchen, there was this storeroom with, these typical kind of stone shelves. And she had a little puja space over there. I mean, there was a lingam over there, a small linga, and some other objects, the lingayat sort of objects. She was the first lingayat I knew well, and seemed to be worshipped with the flowers and all that. And I have a feeling she also wore this string, like the holy thread that they wear around the waist, at that time. I'm not sure, but definitely this was there in the storeroom, like a little puja thing. So I think, as you've written in the book, most of the journalists left when she entered because they just didn't take her seriously. And frankly, she was not really taken seriously as a journalist by anyone. Um so she had to struggle a lot to start writing in Kannada. And in fact, it sounded odd. I think because people were so used to Lankesh's sort of writing, which was so fluent and fluid, and he had this way with words and all that. He was a wonderful writer, actually. So it was always a little, odd. It was never so fluid or so well written, her articles. But she was always very passionate about everything. So it is like, okay, you talk about the journey, that she's this kind of okay, like an ordinary person, then she becomes this kind of almost like a legend, which we're all surprised by, actually. But she was always passionate and about everything that she did. And even this, when I talk about the parties, see, I have a problem with the activists because they're very hostile to artists. They think we're all elite and so on. So there's this kind of, that this activist work is the only work, like, which is serious and so on. But Gauri actually had a lot of different kinds of friends. And I think this continued also because later on, she had a lot of artist friends, designers, different from different fields. She would go off to Koshis and meet somebody. I think Vicky is sitting over here, go off. I said, oh, I met Vicky yesterday for a drink in Koshis or whatever it was. So she was not like a one-dimensional person, She had, and she was also modest. So even when we used to have get-togethers, she wouldn't only talk about herself and the activism she was doing. She'd listen to what other people were saying and so on. And I think that also came into play when where you talked about the Adivasi incident. It's sort of extended into all that, her interest in people and her warmth and all that, because many times she helped us, like, in a very genuine, like a friend. And like, even like, for example, after she died only, I found out that she knew so many of these people, like Tista, who I also know was a very close friend of hers. And she'd gone to JNU during their protests, and that's how she got to know these people. She got to know Jignesh Bevani. In fact, there's this funny she used to sometimes call these people home and call some of us over, like, friends over for dinner or something. And once Jignesh had come over to her place, and I think Chandan and me and who else was, Mamta was there, I think, Mamta Sagar, the poet. So we were sort of had dinner and all that. And then, I told, so Jignesh said, what do you do? I said, I'm an artist. So I said, what do you do? So this Gauri had this photograph of mine, which I'd given her, which was of this early series I did on whereas the Phantom Lady, in this Zorro-like costume where I'm jumping from a building. And she took him over there, and I wish I had a photograph of that. And she showed him this photograph and said, this is her work. And everyone laughed, like, she and Jignesh really sort of cackled. So I think she's that this growth, was also in terms of she didn't change suddenly. It was those qualities she actually had, I know already, which was not developed, and the passion and the commitment in so many ways. Like, she was very committed to her family. They'd fight like hell. She and half the time they were not on talking terms, and but they would make up and become, they also like adored each other. So the mother, the sisters, the brothers, they're constantly at war with each other, and each time she would tell me all these kind of crazy stories. But then, of course, they'd make up. And then, as far as the next generation went, like their kids, she absolutely adored them. And it's also not true that she didn't want to have children. She desperately wanted to have children. I think you've written in your book that she didn't want to have children, but it's not correct, because she almost forced, like, she wanted Aisha to call her mother. So she said, "You must call me Ava." Kavita is Amma and Aisha is Ava.
That's right. Yeah.
She just absolutely, and she somehow took off time, and she was there for them always.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Thank you. You mentioned Lankesh's badminton playing, and it is and it is the Lankesh family kind of collectively has this commitment to badminton. Kavita was going to be here tonight, but she's participating in a badminton tournament. So I hope she did well. Except the exception is Gauri, who was, you could say, exercise averse, right? Yeah. Well,
There is,
yeah.
there is a joke about her sportswomanship. In fact, there was a conversation in Gauri office where Gauri was telling the other colleagues that she won a third prize in a yoga competition. And the colleague immediately asked him, there were only 3 participants in
Yeah, I heard another story too that at the sports day at her school, she came in dead last place. Yeah. Yeah. But yeah, I think she got her exercise through argument.
No, her body didn't require any exercise. Hardly she was 5 foot, and I think coffee was the one thing.
Coffee.
Which was staple food.
Yeah. That's my staple food too.
She used to go off driving. And in fact, when I heard that she had been shot at, I thought she had gone off somewhere in the night, Because sometimes at 2 o'clock in the night or 12 o'clock in the night, she said, "Oh, I'm going to Davangere or somewhere, and to attend some meeting." And she just, I asked her, like, "Are you driving alone in the middle of the night?" She said, "Yeah, yeah," and all that. And it was quite usual for her. So when I heard the news that she was shot, that my friend said she shot at, I thought she had been shot at while in one of these crazy, trips outside Bangalore, not in Bangalore in her house.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, that was part of why it was a shock. It's hard to imagine anyone getting shot in this city. It's just not the kind of crime that you expect here. Yeah.
Agnish Sridhar shot somebody. There was this famous thing, and he was shot at Ashoka Pillar, this kind of mafia don.
Yeah.
That was the other incident.
Yeah. Yeah. Usually it would just be mafia, but even the mafia preferred swords and machetes to guns. Pushpa, you were talking about Lankesh Patrike under P. Lankesh, and this is something I heard from so many of his readers. Just what an extraordinary newspaper that was, and they just make it sound like the greatest newspaper that's ever been published. And it's this. I don't read Kannada, and so this was a real deficit that I had in working on this book, because so much of the book is about these various Kannada literary scenes. But I really wanted to capture the flavor of these various scenes as well as I could. And I really was just so reliant on translators in working on this book. Several translators, especially Amulia Leona, who I think is here today. And Amulia did so much for me. Not least, both of Gauri's parents wrote memoirs, and but that they were only published in Kannada, and I couldn't write a book about Gauri without reading the memoirs. So I actually asked Amulia to translate both of the books in full, and I think I'm still the only person who's read the English translations of these books. Me and Amulia. And I hope they'll actually be published in English, because I especially enjoyed Gauri's mother's memoir. It's really, she wasn't a writer, and she wrote an amazing book. It's incredibly frank, incredibly. I think I've rarely read a memoir that's as honest as hers, and I really recommend looking it up. But yeah, working on a book like this is like, we're so used to thinking of books as having a single author, and my name is big on the cover and no one else is, and it's like we think of books as these things that emerge from one person's solitary genius. And it's absolutely not how it works. They're incredibly collaborative. And there's not a sentence in this book that I could have written without relying on everyone I talked to, many of whom are here today, but also just the work of dozens, hundreds of Indian journalists who I just couldn't have even gotten started on this unless I was drawing on their work constantly. And really, in a lot of ways, I see my book as just simply a distillation of this work that I'm borrowing from all these other writers, and who are writing under much more challenging circumstances than I'm writing under. I can just parachute in here, and I'm not in any personal danger. I don't think I need to worry for myself when I'm here. Not true of the many Indian journalists whose work I relied on to write this, who are often writing what I quoted from, writing what I drew on under enormous pressure and under enormous threat. Yeah. Another thing we were talking about, you were mentioning earlier about the American subtitle of the book, referring to the rise of autocracy. This is something that, Gauri identified this from the beginning, and she spoke about it in no uncertain terms. When Narendra Modi was elected in 2014, a lot of her more conventionally liberal friends downplayed the threat that was coming. And she always saw it with clear eyes. And she was dismissed as being, hysterical or overreacting or emotional. And she was actually right about everything. She was right about everything that she warned about. I've seen the exact same pattern happening in the United States, where, when Trump was first elected, like, oh, he's a buffoon. These comparisons to fascists are overwrought. You can't make these kind of comparisons. No, as it turns out, they were all correct. And we actually should have listened to all of those Nazi parallels that were made. They weren't overwrought. We could have learned something and maybe forestalled it better if we'd actually listened to the voices who were calling it what it is and who saw very clearly what direction things were going. Because these things don't always unfold in their full form immediately after the fascist is elected. It didn't happen immediately after Hitler was elected. It's usually the second term when these things, when these things reach their full form. So I really want to give credit to her for all the naysayers who accused her of being emotional and for being too argumentative and for being overwrought about things. You look back on the record, and she was right about it all. Especially, I will say, about the threat to Indian Muslims, which was a particular concern of hers. Communal harmony, and I'd love for you to speak more on that, was really perhaps her most passionate cause. And she was incredibly disturbed about the marginalization, the vilification of the hate mongering against Indian Muslims, the world's largest minority community. And yet, even though it is the world's largest minority community, it's very easy to ignore what's happening to Indian Muslims, partly because part of the program has been to increasingly segregate the community. And so it's increasingly easy for people who are not a part of that community to genuinely not know what's going on in that community because we're deliberately kept apart. And I found just very often in working on this book that even a lot of the most well-meaning people and the most sympathetic people don't actually grasp how bad things have gotten for Indian Muslims. It's something that Gauri understood very clearly. And I understand why people don't totally grasp it. It's actually punishing to keep up on the news, to take in the full totality of everything that's going wrong, and to get a complete picture is a full-time job, and it's punishing. It's hard to sustain. I find the same thing with Trump now. There are so many different kinds of things going wrong. There are so many different kinds of cruelties on so many different levels and so many different places that it's like, it's actually, and it's obviously deliberate that they're moving so fast and doing so many things at once and making it bewildering and making it overwhelming. But you can't really get how bad things have gotten for the vilified community unless you fully tune in. I don't even know personally what the solution is to it, because when I'm fully tuned into the news, my reaction is typically despair. I feel like there's nothing I can do about it, and all I do is dread for my daughter's future. But at the same time, I feel I have a responsibility to know everything, and I just don't know what to do with that.
I think that's where Gauri comes as a hope. In
Yeah.
fact, Gauri's journalism in that way, I think, is characterized by three values. You asked how Gauri could do that. It was courage, commitment, and conviction. And she was ready to lose something for the cause of truth. And many journalists are not ready to lose either the comfort or the secured life, but she was ready to bet everything. In fact, as you have narrated in the book, the magazine itself never made any profit. In fact, the last phone call I got from Gauri on that day morning was that she has actually put for even her LIC money for the salary of the employees on that month, and she was ready to continue with that. And many friends who are sitting here also were contemplating how to make it run, because that was the only magazine we had, and it was under loss because, in fact, after the advent of this digital media, print journalism has become very difficult, and especially the journalism of Gauri's kind. But she continued there, and in, I think, the any human being's real character comes out in the crisis. She faced many crises in her life, and in all the crises, she has stood with her values, whether personal, social, or the political. She always stood with her values, and she had to sacrifice many things, her whole comfort for that matter, family for that matter. I think there is the lesson. I think if anyone wants to do something, activism or journalism, or activist journalism, I think there is the lesson.
Yeah, well, there's a quote from you I really like, and certainly, absolutely, that Gauri moved from comfort zone to conflict zone. Um, uh, yeah, and I mean, when you get involved in activism, it's a hard road, but the rewards are many too, and it's often the cure for that feeling of impotence and despair. Um, to work on, and I think that was something that Gauri learned too, is that the way to do it is to work on local things. Um, uh, yeah.
Hello, sir. I'm Shinjini. I'm a student of Media Studies from Christ. So, my question is can you please take us through the process of writing this book, especially because it touched upon so many people and it is about somebody who had a deep impact on the city of Bangalore and definitely on the entire landscape of Indian journalism?
Well, thank you so much for the question. Yeah, it was a long process, much longer than I expected. I think that's typically true with books, that writers vastly underestimate how long it takes to write a book. My initial publishing contract said I would deliver it in 18 months, and I think I took 5 years instead. But it's really, I spent a lot of time in Bangalore, obviously, talking to people, retracing Gauri's steps, at one point attending the trial. Um, but also just an enormous amount of reading. And it's really, uh, an enormous act of synthesis. I had a friend compare it once to wilting spinach. You have like all the books and the articles that I had to read. There's this enormous library of words, and it's this, like this big bag of spinach when you bring it home, and then you gradually cook it down, and hopefully it is delicious at the end. Um, um, but yeah, I mean, but really, I think the most important thing to say about it is what I mentioned before about what a truly collaborative process it was and how reliant I was on so many other people. Um, I kind of hate writing. It's not enjoyable. There are moments when it's enjoyable. I think those are fleeting. Um, Sometimes when I was writing, I would stop and not write for a while because writing is miserable. But especially when COVID came, I think I stopped for 6 months completely and did nothing. Because, well, part of it is like, writing is thinking on the page, And when COVID came, I was so obsessed with thinking about COVID, I didn't have any more room in my brain. And so I just simply couldn't write. And so all I did was read news about COVID, most of which turned out to be inaccurate. Another question? Yeah, please, Raghu.
Hi, thank you all
Yeah.
for, yeah.
Oh,
Hi,
yeah,
thank,
sure. And then, yeah.
Thank you all for
Yeah.
a very interesting session. My question is for you, Rollo. Is if you could talk about, describe the audience for this book outside of India and the kind of reaction that you've gotten from them. Thanks.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. You know, when you're writing in English for for an American audience and in some ways an international audience, this is something I thought about a lot. You know, it's related to what we were talking about with Kannada, with like the this rich world of Kannada literature that's so specific. A Kannada writer knows exactly who their audience is. They're writing directly to this audience, and they know who it is. And when Lankesh wrote, when Gauri wrote in Gauri Lankesh Patrike, they were writing directly to people, and they knew who the people were who read them. When I'm writing in English, I don't know who my audience is. It's vague. It's amorphous. It's just this kind of blob of like international English. And I'm so actually jealous of languages like Kannada or Malayalam. My wife is a translator from Malayalam. She translates for the novelist Benjamin, and she tells me these stories about like the kinds of debates that happen at like the Kerala Literature Festival, of like a panel that's getting in a bitter fight about the Kerala coastal novel. We don't have an equivalent of the Kerala coastal novel in the United States. We just have this big blob. It feels like culturally, Of course, there are huge distinctions culturally across the United States, but there's, because of the tyranny of this dominant language, it gets, it all gets diluted, Like I watch Malayalam movies and they're so specific, They're not just so specific to Kerala, they're so specific to, there are Thrissur movies, there are Trivandrum movies, and you can tell from the opening scenes like which kind of Kerala movie it is. And in the US, like, if you see a movie that takes place in Oklahoma, it's like Hollywood's idea of Oklahoma. And we don't have an Oklahoma movie, And so it's a bit of a challenge writing for an American audience, especially when Americans are often pretty incurious about what's going on outside of America. And so there's a lot of, I have to write in this way that assumes that the reader knows absolutely nothing. But actually, this edition of the book is in some ways quite a bit different from the U.S. edition because I cut out tons of explanation. I don't know how many. Maybe my editor Ajita knows. She's here, but like how many pages in total were cut out of the book because there was so much that I needed to explain from scratch. In a way, I find that to be a kind of a fun puzzle. Like how do I explain something for an audience that knows nothing about India, but in a way that will hopefully still be interesting and put a fresh twist on it for an Indian reader. And it's a tall order since I'm an outsider from here, but I find it to be an interesting challenge. But I really feel like the true audience for this book is Indian and specifically is in this room.
Yeah, that's a good idea because the two people who just went before me preempted exactly what I wanted to ask you. So I do want to say that you've been extremely modest and generous to everyone who's contributed to your book by acknowledging them this way. But I have to insist that you take some credit for the effort of doing all of that writing and all of that synthesis. And to me, it's frankly miraculous that you've made a story like this publishable in the United States and brought it to the attention of the Pulitzer Committee and made it a Pulitzer finalist. So true congratulations on doing that.
And well, thank you, Raghu. That means a lot coming from you in particular. I'm such an admirer of your rating.
Thank you. So this act of what you have to do then is this act of additional translation of so much of all of the texture and the nuance of not just India but of Karnataka and all of this the sort of the sub communities within Karnataka that are involved here. Lingayats and Veerashaivas and there's so many people in Bangalore who don't know these distinctions, which you both had to master and translate. So I just want to push you a little bit further on. I'm curious about what your communication was like, for instance, with your editors. So just to make it more precise, not just who your audience was in the United States, but what were your American editors' responses? Because obviously they bought it. They want someone, and your publisher, for instance, decided to publish this book. How did they come around to that?
Yeah, actually, in some. Oh, a couple questions. Sorry, yeah.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to just say one word about myself, that I am not from Bangalore, but I've only recently relocated. So I'm just about 3 months old in Bangalore. And when I read the review of this book, which was in no way connected to this program today, I just jumped at it because I needed to read about Gauri Lankesh, because sitting in Delhi, where I was when she was assassinated, we were all so affected, with the even though we had never heard of her before. But the fact that as things started to come out, in the press about her, so it was so your book really, for an outsider like me, is not just about Gauri Lankesh, but it's such an amazing introduction to the intelligentsia, the literati, the social networks, the whole political situation. It's such an educative book. So I really wanted to congratulate you about that. And having said that, I just wanted to take you, take you up on one line, which is a digression from our focus lens this evening on Gauri, which has been very good, incidentally. In your book, Shivsundar, you were talking about the digressions that he has made on Doubting Thomas, in that chapter. Would you like to comment on this, which really kind of took me back? I found it very interesting. In Kerala, and I'm quoting now, in Kerala, the RSS is a powerhouse, but the BJP remains a punchline. Would you like to comment on that?
That's a really interesting question that I actually don't know the answer to. So there are actually more RSS shakas in Kerala than in any other state, which surprised a lot of people who know Kerala's reputation as being, a very progressive state. But yet the BJP has had very little electoral success. There's one BJP legislator right now. There had been one previously. Their vote share is progressively increasing, but still far below Karnataka's, of course. I actually don't really know the answer to that. Why the RSS has been, and the RSS has been deeply entrenched in Kerala from the beginning. It's got a 100-year history. Why is the RSS so popular and successful there, where the BJP is not? I don't know. Shivsundar, what do you think? Yeah. And thank you for your comments about, the book's depiction of Bangalore. It's terrifying to be in front of a Bangalore crowd who knows the city much better than I do. And you probably spotted a lot of errors in my depiction, but it really, in a lot of ways, the book is a love letter to Bangalore, a city I really adore, and all of its quirks and particularities. And that to me was one of the most enjoyable parts of writing the book, is really trying to capture Bangalore as I've known it. I'm trying to remember Raghu's question. Oh yeah, editors, yeah. Yeah, in terms of American editors, I actually found it to be a huge advantage having an editor who actually knew next to nothing about India. That was actually really helpful because then I knew how much more I needed to explain. And in a lot of ways, she was kind of, my target American reader, someone who was interested but didn't know anything about it. And so she was and intelligent, she's very smart, of course. And that, so she was a great sounding board for what I needed to explain and also what I was over explaining. And for the American audience, I was really happy with how we struck that balance. And it was actually essential that she didn't know a lot about it. But then that meant that I didn't have feedback on what I was getting right and wrong. And that's incredibly important. That's the most important thing. And so I just made sure to have many Indian readers of the manuscript. First of all, my wife, who tells me always in no uncertain terms what I've gotten wrong. She saved me from many embarrassing errors over the years, and I'm deeply grateful for that.
Good evening, everyone. Myself, Prachi from St. Joseph's University. I'm pursuing my journalism over there. My question is for Shivsundar, sir. So you kept on mentioning there is possibility of transformation. So, sir, I want to know more, like, what context were you saying this? Are you aspiring journalists, like young journalists, to be more motivated for investigative journalism, like Gauri Lankesh, ma'am, or what is it? Can you please elaborate more, sir?
Hi, I'm Matthew. I'm a second year journalism student from St. Joseph's. So a lot of my classmates, we are under the glorious SCP curriculum, so we can choose which subject to major in. A lot of us don't want to pursue journalism because we're kind of taught to navigate between media laws and stop short of critiquing the government. What do you think a journalist in the current era of media censorship should really do? Should we wait for the laws to be more lenient? Do we all have to be activists as well as journalists, or do we just leave India so we don't get hurt?
It's such a tough question. I mean, journalism is in such crisis in so many ways. The business models are all collapsing. There's intense political pressure. I mean, as soon as you write something honest, you're under threat of tax raid. Your newsroom is. You're personally under threat of, frivolous defamation lawsuits. You might even be charged under terrorism law, especially if you're a Muslim journalist, like my friend Shahina KK in Kerala, who says there's an absurd case against her, charging her with terrorism for doing journalism. It's a very difficult question to answer because I can't recommend to anyone that they put themselves directly in the line of these threats. It's a lot to ask of somebody. And I feel like there's not a satisfactory answer. I mean, I'm encouraged by the fact that that online outlets have been able to flourish a bit more in India than print publications in terms of being honestly critical. And I think that there is an enormous shift going on in journalism. It's very. I mean, you put aside the political context, and it's incredibly difficult to make a living at journalism because all the business models are collapsing. But I'm actually optimistic about the future of journalism because I think that these kinds of intensely repressive moments like this actually tend to lead to a flourishing and a renaissance of journalism when that becomes possible. That's exactly what we saw after the emergency, where it was really, in a lot of ways, a golden age of Indian journalism immediately after. And I also think that, it's time to shake off a lot of the old models. the problems that I have with the New York Times as this monolithic institution that is like, it feels like it's, you know, all the local newspapers in the United States are failing. Even the Washington Post looks like it's in a steep descent. And it feels like we're reaching the situation where the New York Times is the only newspaper, and that it's got this monolithic control over who knows what. And we need new models. And in some places we're seeing that in the flourishing of newsletters, where journalists are able to be much more independent than if they work for a legacy corporation. The challenge with that, though, is when you run a newsletter, you have to be an entrepreneur. You have to be good at building a brand for yourself. I could never do that personally. I couldn't even. That's a non-starter for me. Like starting the Rollo Romig newsletter, it's like unthinkable. But it's encouraging to me that there are, you know, and I don't know if it's as popular here in India as it is in the United States. But this has become a really popular forum for journalists. A lot of journalists have quit their news organizations and have just launched their own newsletters. And people pay by digital. And so they actually come by email. And Substack, exactly, Substack. Exactly. And so people pay by subscription or donation, and the journalist has a great deal more freedom as a result. There's lots of really interesting new stuff, because it's not even just the fact that journalists can be more honest when they're self-publishing in that way. It's that there's this freedom to kind of invent new forms, you know, that you don't have to formally be stuck in the old modes of like newspaper article, opinion piece. You can invent your own style. I think it's really exciting, actually. And some people are managing to make a living off of it.
I will be brief. I think all journalist students are actually given some example, you know, in fact, how to report. In fact, if there is raining outside and if journalists and people are actually inside the room, and if somebody says it's raining outside, if somebody says it's not raining outside, the function of the journalist is not to report that somebody is saying it's raining and somebody is saying it's not raining. You should open the window and see to yourself whether it is raining or not. That is, it is taught in the journalist classrooms, and that is truth seeking. Activism and journalism both actually stem from seeking the truth. But Gauri went a step ahead, that is called activist journalism. She also asked more questions. Who are actually people who are there outside without having a shelter, who are actually drenching in the rain? Why they don't have shelter? And what can I do? So it directly relates to the purpose of the life, one who has to decide for himself, whether it is journalism, activism, or whatever profession. That philosophical question, what is the purpose of your life? I think Gauri answered in her own way, and we have to answer in our own.
So I was curious. You said that a lot of people had a lot of perceptions about who Gauri Lankesh was as a person. So when you were doing all of the research and trying to find out who she really was and what her ideals were, was it hard for you to condense all of these perceptions into a solid character for, you know, especially for the audiences in America and even, you know, in India who did not know her that well? Was it hard for you? How did you navigate that idea?
That was actually the thing that I think sustained me through this long project, was the wonderful challenge of trying to capture a person who I never met in their full complexity. And when there were contradictions, when there were people who disagreed about aspects of her life, that you don't have to smooth everything out. You don't have to resolve everything. That we all are contradictory, and all of us are not fully known, even to those who know us best. And that to me is really the heart of the book. So I was always happy when I heard something about Gauri that added a new dimension of understanding to who she was. and to make it even more complicated than it had been previously.
I was just reflecting on what you had just said. See, under the Karnataka government's proposed misinformation and fake news bill, what you have said makes you guilty of speaking against Sanatana Dharma. So, I knew why I am mentioning this so in such an emphatic way. I knew Gauri, I knew Lankesh, and this kind of crusading spirit was at one time much admired in public service journalism. In fact, there was a time when they came to the mainstream of journalism. Now they have been pushed to the sidelines. So my question is there a climate for what shall I say, active injustice, developing in this country, where even when it appears that justice can be delivered, it will not be done, or there is a public clamor. Now, when you say, for instance, 10,000 pages, there is an FIR, you have again that Bihar JNU scholar, 34,000 pages of FIR. These are intended to overawe the judiciary from doing its job. And when it happened, like in this Mumbai High Court recently, the people are acquitted. Immediately, the next day, there are screaming articles in newspapers. Then who is to be punished for this? It's not as if the police didn't do their job, and it's not some, advocate, a politician. It's somebody like Mihir Desai who had argued for the stand from his case. So one finds that first, the climate for justice, do you feel that it is shrinking? And active reinforcement of a climate where these kind of things can be carried out with impunity. Thank you.
And Rollo, maybe you can take the view of what's happening in the US as well.
Yeah, sure.
Something similar is happening there as well. So
There
perhaps you could
absolutely
comment on that.
is, because we have the problem of our, a full third of our Supreme Court was appointed by Trump. There's a supermajority of conservatives on the court. It was a court that used to be respected regardless of who was appointed on it. That's gone now. I know there's a similar feeling now here. It's when the courts get politicized, I've just been marveling at what mayhem it creates, because the courts have always been problematic. I would never fully defend the US justice system in the best of times. I think it's, I was really interested. I saw a documentary recently about this civil rights lawyer in the United States named Chase Strangio, who recently argued before the Supreme Court. And someone asked him, how he felt about practicing law. And he said, I think it's an interesting intellectual exercise, but actually, I don't have a love for the law. I think the law is a system of violence. And I look at my job as trying to protect people from the harms of that violence as much as I can. And we idealize our justice systems to a great degree, to a greater degree than they often deserve. I think anytime that officials insist upon wearing robes to indicate their majesty, they're hiding something untoward underneath. But when the justice system is politicized, it's just another way that the sense of common reality becomes eroded. And that's one of the most unnerving aspects of what's been happening in India, in the US, and in many other countries, is just this sense that we're living in two different realities, and that there's not even a point in having a conversation because we don't even have a common perception and a common language. That when a court rules, that you can't even trust that they're operating from basic facts. It's actually quite unnerving. But I also feel that, I've been, in these intensely polarized times, I've often been reluctant to have conversations with people who have far different politics than my own. and to kind of test that proposition that we live in different realities. And actually, often when I do have those conversations, I find that the interaction is much more human than I expected. And so we also shouldn't accept the idea that there is no possibility for conversation, because that's something that Gauri absolutely rejected. You know, she relentlessly argued with trolls on social media. You know, her friends often said, please stop, this is pointless. They're trolls. They're just trying to, they're arguing in bad faith. They're trying to get at you. She invited them to coffee. And she was always, as she never backed down from her actual positions, but she was always ready to have a conversation with someone else. And I've been trying to take that to heart more too. Because how can we bridge these, you know, divergent realities without conversation?
And I have nothing to add, but I have one request made by the Gauri Memorial Trust friends, Professor Nagargare Ramesh and Dr. Sridhar is there. On every September 5th, the day Gauri was assassinated, the Gauri Memorial Trust observes that as a Gauri Memorial Day. Even this year, there is going to be a commemoration of Gauri Memorial Day. They would, we request you to please participate in that.
In 2017, when Gauri Lankesh was murdered, the shooters weren't killing her, they were trying to kill an idea. And part of that idea were Kalburgi, Pansare, and Dabholkar. The fact that so many of you are here today, and so many of you who are young and thinking differently, is proof that that idea still lives on. And an important reminder that it's an idea that we have to keep fighting for. Rollo, thank you for writing this very, very important book.